My name is Pete Higgins. I'm a Professor of Outdoor Environmental and Sustainability Education at the University of Edinburgh. And I work in each of these three areas, and I work across those three areas. Now, before I start, I should really give you a little background on how I come to be doing the job that I do. And I always tell my students that everything that I say comes from a context within which I grew up and within which I operate now, and that to critique everything that I say from that particular perspective. So I'm the only person in my family ever to go to a university. I grew up in the southwest of England, down in Somerset, and from essentially an agricultural labourer's family. I was one of the fortunate ones that went to school to the age of 18 and actually did okay at school. I didn't do well, I did okay, but I managed to go to a university. And through that opportunity, I had so many other opportunities which would not have come my way otherwise. In particular, I have had the opportunity to study across a range of the sciences, the environmental sciences, education, and indeed forms of education which are not common around the world, including sustainability education and outdoor education. I now work in a small team here within the School of Education. It's Murray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh, and we work across a range of education programs here, but particularly with our master's students, and we work specifically with master's degrees in outdoor environmental and sustainability education, outdoor education and learning for sustainability, three interlinked master's programs. But I work across the university as well. I also have quite an extensive role in policy development associated with learning for sustainability. And it's particularly that area that I wish to talk with you about today. Probably the most important thing you might pick up from this is that there is a term that we use here in Scotland which is called learning for sustainability. Now, that is not a common term in sustainability education. Many people will be familiar with education for sustainable development. This is the term that was originally used and has been used very successfully for quite a long time. But my colleagues and I have always had some discontent about that term because we felt that it was all about telling people stuff. And indeed now we have a great emphasis on carbon literacy, climate literacy, nature literacy. Literacy is important. We all need to be literate. We need to be able to do all the key skills of reading, writing, arithmetic, etc. And we need to learn our subject disciplines. But actually, sustainability is beyond knowledge. It requires an emotional engagement and an understanding of the ways in which people live and indeed the way in which we relate to nature, to the natural world. And so in 2011, when I was asked by Scottish ministers to set up a group which would advise them on sustainability education, I took the opportunity and convened a group of people, and we came up with the term and a definition of learning for sustainability. So before I start talking about learning for sustainability specifically, I should tell you a little about the way in which Scotland's government organises itself and the way in which it has certain responsibilities for certain issues. Education has always been something that was controlled within Scotland for Scottish school pupils. And although Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, so that's England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, each of them has devolved responsibility for education. And this predates the recent re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament. But following the re-establishment of that Parliament, Scottish ministers decided that they would like to review aspects of Scottish education policy. And through that process, in 2011, I was asked to chair what became known as the Learning for Sustainability Advisory Group. So now I'll talk a little about what that process was and what it led to. So, as I said, I convened a group of people to work with me on that process, and we spent some time, just about a year, discussing issues around sustainability education, the way in which it could be further developed within Scotland, the way in which it would relate to other aspects of Scottish education, and indeed to try to frame it in a manner that was meaningful, and more meaningful than those of us who've been working in this field for some time felt was currently the case with existing definitions. We came up with the term learning for sustainability to essentially embrace some of those more engaging aspects of education that are beyond knowledge. And I'll read you the definition so that you understand the term that we use here. Learning for sustainability is a whole school approach that enables the school and the wider community to build values, attitudes, knowledge and skills and confidence to develop practices and take decisions which are compatible with a sustainable and equitable society. Now that's quite a long definition, but actually if you look at the words in there, there's only one that deals with knowledge. There's one that deals with skills. All the rest are about ways of being, ways of engaging, and ways of acting and bringing about change. Because there is one thing for sure with regard to sustainability, we haven't got too much time left in order to make the really significant changes that we need to make. Knowledge alone won't do it. So that was our definition at the end of our year's worth of work. And we set up a framework within which schools could operate that we felt was meaningful, that helped them to deliver on this educational priority. One other element of this that is quite unusual and indeed probably we think unique around the world is that back then we realized that the outdoors had a really significant impact in terms of the way in which people engaged with sustainability issues. So we brought together three ideas. Education for sustainable development. We know what that means. It's all about climate change and the way in which the world is changing. Global citizenship, caring about people in other parts of the world. And then outdoor learning, or as we refer to it in the context of learning for sustainability, engaging with the natural world. That engagement seems to have a stimulating effect and engender an attitude of care and connection. And just to divert just for a moment there, I've used two C words, care and connection. And some time ago in my own research, following reading that I'd done from around the world on sustainability and our relationship with the world, I concluded that we were poorly connected to the natural world, to the systems that we operate within. We don't know where the air comes from that we breathe, the water comes from that we, if we're very fortunate, comes out of our taps, or the food comes from, certainly if we live in the global north. It just arrives, maybe through a supermarket and water through a tap. And so I concluded that actually we're disconnected from those systems and all the other systems that sustain us. And that one of the fundamental projects in education should be to reconnect us with those vital systems, because of course they relate to sustainability and climate change. So that's another C, it's connection. If you understand the connection that you have, then you might well think about the consequences of your actions, particularly if you impact upon those systems. So from connection to consequences of actions. Through that, there is an easy line to follow to an ethic of care and indeed citizenship, if you like. So the idea that we develop a sense of care through that connection is a theme within learning for sustainability. Now, the outdoor learning part of this, it's a term that we tend to use here for a whole range of outdoor educational engagements, is probably worth talking a little bit more about before I move on. And the research evidence that my colleague Beth Christie and I came up with back in 2011 to 2012 that supported learning for sustainability suggested that there were broader benefits of outdoor learning beyond just stimulating the idea that we would would become more sustainable through engaging with the natural world. And indeed, we followed this up with a Scottish Government commissioned report in 2020 on the educational outcomes of learning for sustainability. And what we found within that study is that, first of all, learning for sustainability is a worthwhile concept, that it does do what it is supposed to do in terms of encouraging people to think differently and more connectedly and to become more engaged in acting for a sustainable future. But what we also found, and we weren't particularly looking for it, is that outdoor learning is a powerful way of engaging young people in a whole range of academic subjects. And there is an increasing range of literature out there, very good research-based literature, which shows that if you want to take, if you take kids outside and you educate them outside, they'll probably learn better than if they're learning the same subject matter inside, no matter what that material is. It isn't about biology or geography. It can be, but it can also be about learning a language, or it can be about mathematics. I don't want to follow that up particularly here, but you can find information about this in our research reports if you're interested. Okay, so where to go from here? We've got Scottish Government accepting our report in 2012, and I can tell you that I was quite amazed when they accepted all of our 5 key findings and our 5 key recommendations, and all, I think there were 32 other sub-recommendations. I'd never heard of a report being accepted in full like that. And that report suggested that we should have we should use the term learning for sustainability, we should use the definition, that there should be a whole school approach to learning for sustainability, that all teachers and education professionals should engage in it in their professional practice and in their professional update, and that there should be an ongoing development of learning for sustainability leading to further action in the future. So that was accepted in 2012. And then in 2016, we reconvened and specifically set about linking learning for sustainability with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which many of you will know were established in 2015 on a 15-year project to 2030. And we're getting pretty close now to 2030. And it will be interesting to see how much movement and progress there's been in those SDGs. So it was an easy fit in a way, because we'd been working on learning for sustainability throughout that period, to put it alongside the Sustainable Development Goals. And that gave us the opportunity to embed it further within the school system. I should say here that in Scotland, all teachers and education professionals are required to be registered with what's called the General Teaching Council for Scotland. Alongside our work on learning for sustainability, the General Teaching Council made learning for sustainability a priority in their work, and they used this as part of their reconceptualizing of what they do, to make sure that teachers realised how significant it was, and that process has continued. Each time the professional standards have been reviewed, most recently just in 2022. Teachers are required to go through professional update every 5 years, and that includes learning for sustainability. And in addition to that, we had a parallel thread of work with the Scottish Qualifications Authority, trying to ensure that we, as best we can, embed learning for sustainability in all school curricula. This isn't a kind of one-off big bang thing. Each time a subject comes up for review, so that could be geography, it could be English, it could be history. When that subject comes up for review, it is then reviewed with the view, how do we embed learning for sustainability in that review process? It's also now included in the school's inspection protocols and the internal schools review processes. So we're doing what we can to make this not just some bland policy concept, but something that is embedded throughout what it really means to be a learner and what it really means to be a teacher within the Scottish education system at present. I should add that there is an international development associated with this, which is that we're not involved directly, but we're aware that there are European initiatives now to embed learning for sustainability across European countries and some international ones. Now, how each country chooses to approach sustainability education is, of course, up to that country. But I think if I was to say there's a theme in this that would be useful for anyone in any country, it is that approach to a broad understanding of the complexity and interdisciplinary nature of sustainability demands that you approach it with that respect, with that understanding, and with the idea that knowledge alone won't do the trick. Secondly, that actually engaging young people particularly in the natural world and helping them to understand that the natural world provides so many of the things that help to sustain us is a core element that would work well alongside education for sustainable development and global citizenship. Again, a little diversion with regard to engagement with the natural world. We will not have a sustainable future if we don't recognize that we are a part of, not apart from, the natural world. What does that mean, and what does that mean to me? So personally, and I can't expect anyone else to follow this credo, I suppose, but I can't help but think of myself as connected to organisms in other parts of the world, and that in a way, the simple way of thinking about this is that every breath I take includes a whole range of molecules that I will then exhale, and those molecules will drift around the world, and it is highly likely that some plant or some animal in some other part of the world will at some point pick up one of the carbon atoms that I've exhaled. Now, you can't be much more connected than that. The very constituents of my body are connected to the very constituents of other bodies in other parts of the world through that respiration process. All right, it's much more complex than that. But notionally, what that does, it helps me to think about my responsibilities. And so when I make sustainability choices, and I make some good ones and I make some bad ones, I'm always thinking about what the long-term consequences of these are. So if I drive a car, and I do, and I was in a car yesterday, then I recognize that through the process of driving that car, I am probably impacting on the potential of an organism to evolve in 10,000 or 100,000 years' time in some other part of the world. That deep connection with natural systems is not something that stops me doing things, but it helps me to be mindful about the decisions that I make. And many of us make tiny, tiny little decisions on a daily basis. I'm going to recycle that. Will that recycle? I don't know. I haven't got time to worry about it. Right, no, I'm going to really focus on this, and I'm going to see if I can find out whether this thing is recyclable or not, and then I'm going to deal with it. Sometimes I do the right thing, sometimes I do the wrong thing. I'm about to cross a road, and I see cars coming, and there's a pedestrian crossing, so I get the opportunity to have the cars stop for me to cross the road, to go to the other side. Do I do that, or do I wait till the cars have gone and then skip across the road without causing the cars to slow down, which of course will then cause them to use more fossil fuels in order to speed up again? So I think that way, and I don't expect anyone else to think that way. I'm just trying to give a glimpse as to what trying to live mindfully might mean in the context of sustainability, and at the same time to say that I make decisions which are not sustainable, as well as make decisions that, as best as I know, are. Okay, where to go from all this? The future here in Scotland looks set to continue with this commitment to learning for sustainability. Indeed, the Scottish Government has refreshed and is going through a review process at the moment on what's called its National Performance Framework. And this is the way in which it establishes its values associated with targets that it sets, the performance of which are then monitored. And at the heart of this, there are terms like kindness and well-being. And I feel very fortunate to live in a country where these are at the core of the way in which government does its business, really. And governments have lots to do that aren't about kindness and well-being, but actually having that as a core value really does help in terms of reminding government and allowing people like myself who work with policymakers and ministers that underpinning all of the day-to-day decisions are these core themes, these core values. Now, imposing values on people just never, ever, ever works. But helping people to develop values and helping people to review their values is a powerful way of trying to work out what works and how does it work and how can we bring about change and what will impede that change. And in terms of our own future development, and I mean myself as well as any of you who might be watching this, it's easy to say, oh, you should take that course, or you should take the other course, or you'll learn about this, or you'll learn about that. Really, proper learning takes place when you take responsibility for it. So taking responsibility for me, and I can only speak for me in terms of my own learning, my own practice with my own students, and maybe this is of some help to you, is I think really carefully about everything that I do when I'm teaching. My professional development comes from me thinking, if I have a go at that, if I try that differently this time, I wonder how it's going to work. And then following up and then researching it. I don't mean, writing a big highfalutin academic paper. I'm not a good academic, but I try to review, reflect, and evaluate what I do. The most powerful forms of professional development lie in that concept. And they lie, with me anyway, in being completely honest with my students and saying to them what I've just said to you, that if I'm teaching sustainability, I do things that aren't sustainable. I try to do things as well as I can. I try to be the best person I can in that regard. But actually I won't always get it right. But also to ask those students to constantly critique what I do and to ask themselves, why is he telling me this now? And what difference does it make? So my own mantra when I'm about to teach is very closely associated with that question that I ask our students to think of when I'm teaching. And it's this, I've got a kind of fictionary post-it note by my keys when I pick up my keys and leave the house in the morning. And it says, Pete, are you teaching today? Have you left your ego at home? Can you say why you're going to teach this matter with these people in this place now? Because if I can't answer all of those questions, why this particular subject matter, why these particular people in this place now, then I'm not reflecting adequately before I start to teach. And that reflection process, I'm sure you'll all do this. All of you experienced teachers will do this. That reflection process before you start is profoundly important. And I suppose I can summarize it by saying, never put your body where your head hasn't been first. Just make sure you think ahead to what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and then really think about what the impact's going to be. And yes, sometimes that's about knowledge. Sometimes it's about attitudes and values, and sometimes it's about action. Sustainability as a concept demands action. And the last thing we can do is allow ourselves the indulgence of thinking that we will permit the next generation to come along to deal with the mess that we've left the world in without contributing to that process ourselves and engaging with them. And in my own experience, I've never met students who, when I didn't work with them on particular issues and feel that we were working in the same direction, responded anything other than positively. So I hope this helps in terms of giving you some kind of understanding of the way in which, rather imperfectly, we're struggling and kind of groping our way towards a sustainable education system here in Scotland. And I wish you well with all your own efforts, wherever you may be.
Pete, you've developed different models about sustainability, and one of them is 6 C's model. Can you tell a little bit more about this model?
Yes, I could. And I suppose it stems from a sense that I realised quite a long while ago that I was not feeling connected to the natural world. And so I did some thinking on this, and I recognised that in order to feel connected, you first of all have to recognise that the world's a very complex place. So that's the first C, really. Complexity is everywhere. My connection with the natural world then extends beyond the natural world to people and planet, if you like, and indeed to place. And there's a lot of research literature about this now. People, place, planet is often said, but what about that without some form of connection? And how do they relate to each other? My next stage in thinking was, well, what about the consequences of my actions? What about the consequences of my actions when I engage with people? We think about that a lot. But what about other ways in which we have consequences to our actions, particularly, say, with regard to the planet and planetary systems, if we're thinking about sustainability? So that's the consequences bit. If you get that complexity, that connection, those consequences, and you take the trouble to care about those things, you develop an ethic of care. Again, the same theme running through, an ethic of care for people and sustainability. And then people talk a lot about citizenship, and citizenship to me is quite a vacuous concept. It can mean all sorts of things, from engaging in civic society through to how you use your vote, multidimensional. But for me, citizenship has to embrace the notion of being a good citizen for the place that you live in, and that includes the planet. And then the final thing as an educator, and that's what I do for a good part of my job, is to encourage people to review this model and ways of thinking about complexity and connection and care with critical thinking, because without critically analysing the ways in which educational ideas are presented, other conceptual ideas are presented, then we won't make progress. So I always urge people, yes, to use a model if it's useful to them, but also to critique it and to make sure that they use their critical thinking skills, because in the end it's those critical thinking skills that are actually even more important than perhaps those ideas of connection and consequence.
Speaking of complexity, I just wonder, how much do people need to understand about the world in terms of time and space and different fields and sciences and social sciences?
Yeah, you're quite right. It is bewildering if you try to fully understand everything, and nobody ever has and nobody ever will. What I try to focus on are, I suppose, the core issues of the way in which natural systems function, and by that I mean basic ecological principles that essentially we are part of a natural world and that we're not apart from it, that we are able to recognise that the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat are all parts of systems that we utterly depend upon, that actually the impact that we have on one issue, on one place, can have much more significant consequences than that. To look in terms of their relationships with other people, to recognise that there are complex systems that demands some understanding of as well. In other words, my relationship with you is linked to many other relationships that we have with other people, and so there's complexity in there as well. And you can't know everything, but what you can know is that the world is complex, is that almost everything is connected to almost everything else. And by that I'm using the word thing, but I actually think that extends to many concepts and to many actions. So in particular, if I give a sustainability example, every decision you make on what you eat, for example, has an impact in some way or another. And understanding how food systems operate is probably one of the best ways in which you can engage with sustainability, because we all know that we should, not all of us, but many people know now, that we should eat less meat, less dairy, we should be less wasteful, we should avoid plastic packaging, that we should avoid damaging systems that operate to our benefit. and imposing systems on agriculture that actually have negative effects on the environment more generally. We know that we should do this, so understanding some of those connections is enough, I think, to help to make a start. And the thing is, we'll always make imperfect decisions, but trying to understand that some of the complexity that underlies them really helps in thinking, why am I doing this now? Why am I making this decision now? Why am I, do I really need to drive my car? Because I do understand that driving my car will produce emissions which have an impact on climate change, albeit tiny. Do I really need to eat this meat, which I have an option to eat, or can I choose something else? Those sorts of complexities are there, and trying to understand the basis of those complexities, I think, is adequate, as long as you just keep thinking, right, what's the next layer? Can I go a little deeper? And my experience of teaching is that students really get this, and they like that idea that they're empowered to go deeper into understandings, as long as you make the right start with them.
But it seems a lot of these individual decisions to act more environmentally is based on what systems are set around you. What kind of transportation systems are already there, what food is available, the way cities are designed. So do you see that there is any role of learning for sustainability or environmental education in enabling people to change the very systems that influence their choices and behavior?
Can I just say this is the perfect follow-up question, because we're sitting here in Scotland, in Edinburgh, outside the Scottish Parliament. There are vehicles going around us at the moment that the roads have been designed specifically for that purpose, to take us around the Parliament, take them around the Parliament. The Queen's, as it was, and now the King's House over here in the Palace of Holyrood House is just over here, where the seat of power used to be for Scotland, and now the real seat of power for Scotland is in the Parliament opposite. The systems and structures that we operate within are mediated by those historic and current systems. And truly to get to the core of what sustainability means, to me, is actually engaging with those systems. It is saying, I have a vote and I'm going to use it. And I'm going to use it for the parties that will support our path to a more sustainable and more equitable, more socially just future. And so engaging with political systems is really important. Now, it's not easy in Scotland, but it is much more straightforward. I can talk to ministers if I wish to, and ministers are keen to speak to the public. They do engage. It isn't straightforward, it isn't easy, but it is quite possible to do so. Not every country has that benefit, but in every country there are people who make decisions, and finding ways of trying to encourage them to make good decisions through our votes is profoundly important. Trying to encourage them to make decisions which follow I suppose the idea that we care for our citizens and we care for the environment that we live within now and for the future is really core. And so engaging in that democratic process, if you are in a position to do so, writing letters, writing to, by that these days it's an email of course, to ask for politicians to make good policy decisions and local policy makers to do the same, to engage with that process and to just keep trying and keep pushing is profoundly important. And I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, but I remember hearing a while back that if a politician gets 40 letters, as was probably now 40 emails individually written about an issue, they think this is really important. So be one of those 40 people to send the email and you might make a difference. As long as it's not a form letter, as long as it's heartfelt, and as long as it gives suggestions for positive actions, then you'll often find policymakers will listen because they think it's a really significant issue. And again, you know, as best you can, get the best evidence you can and present it as a solution rather than a problem.
And do you have any specific suggestions for teachers and educators to nurture this sense of citizenship among students and to empower them to realize that they can influence the systems, even maybe before they become voters?
Well, I think it's important to think about young people as citizens in the first place. So, for example, at what age do we consider a young person to become a citizen? Are they a citizen at the age that they can drive a car? A citizen at the age they can vote? At the age they can join the military and go and fight for their country? At the age they can get married or have consensual sex? We have different ages for all of these in our country, and we have different ages for all of these between one country and another. There's no consistency of approach in our recognition of young people as citizens, and we often treat them as citizens in waiting. And in schools in particular, lots of powers that young people would have at home or in the community are taken away because of the way in which schools operate, because they operate within strict structures. Now, I understand that works and it enables organisation to take place, but some consistency of approach, recognition of student voice is profoundly important, especially if you want those people to become the young adults who become the older adults who have been involved in the educational process themselves, understand that future educational process for others, but profoundly importantly in the political process, with a small p right through to the big P, the ministers of the future. So schools have a duty, I think, to try to build structures which allow students in those schools to exercise their opportunities to learn to be citizens, to make decisions, and to make decisions that have consequences within the school, even if those consequences are ones that the teachers don't like, and they may well be to do with things associated with how the school's organised. One thing that baffles me is that young people are often allowed to walk from home across busy streets into school, and all the way there they can make decisions on a whole range of different things. When they're in the school, they can't make decisions on a whole range of simple matters. Young people find it hard to get up in the morning. They're not good learners early in the day. If you ask young people about when school should start, they'd say probably 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. When would they say school would stop? They would probably agree that they need the same number of hours to do the stuff that they need to do at school. They just need to start later because their brains are changing. Well, you disempower young people by forcing them to learn at times of the day when their brains aren't ready to learn. You know, there are many things about the way in which we affect the lives of young people without giving them the opportunities to tell us what they would like and then to try to act on it. Now, I know that's a really radical thought that we might actually change the school day, but it is being discussed here and in some other countries. Would you rather have effective learners or ones that are half asleep? Well, ask the kids when they're going to be most awake. It's obvious if they say, well, from 11 o'clock onwards, okay, let's arrange classes for that time. If they are in school, give them the opportunity to choose the things earlier in the day that might require them to use less brain power, for example. So there are many ways in which we think we understand how young people operate, but we don't really give them the chance. If you want to find out what a 10-year-old thinks, ask a 10-year-old. You want to find out what an 8-year-old thinks, ask an 8-year-old. It'll be different. And then when you get to a 16-year-old, it'll be a different again. So ask them and see what they say. And that way you're engaging them as a citizen within the school environment. I could say more, but I don't think much of it would go down particularly well with people who make decisions on the way in which schools operate, which is precisely the point.
Now, switching from students as citizens to teachers and educators as citizens, do you see any role of educators and teachers in schools and maybe non-formal organizations as well in influencing educational policies and in educational reform that will be more in favor of including and integrating sustainability education?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is that it's easy to think that education systems have been in place for hundreds of years, indeed maybe thousands of years. But actually here in Scotland, formalised education in schools came about through an Act of Parliament 120 years ago. And the same is pretty much true of England and many other countries. The formalising of education is very recent. So it doesn't make any sense to think that you can't change things. So that's the first thing. You have to have a mindset that says things can change. And in some countries, I know it's far more difficult than in other countries to bring about change. But the role of teachers is in some ways to challenge the system that they operate within. Yet you have a curriculum you have to teach, you don't have a choice about that. But actually engaging in the process of how that curriculum might change is something that many teachers do get an opportunity to do, particularly as qualifications are developed and the way in which those qualifications are then embedded within school systems. So there are small ways like this. Other ways relate to making sure that your professional body, if you have one, is engaged with the politicians who make the decisions, and to try as best you can to inspire them and enthuse them about what some positive forms of educational change might be. Another thing that I've found quite useful personally is to not necessarily suggest radical change, but to suggest meaningful but small steps changes that politicians and indeed other teachers can work with. One thing that is particularly important in sustainability is not feeling lonely. So many teachers feel that I'm the one person in the school who is able to bring about any kind of change in interest amongst my colleagues. Right, see if you can get an ally, see if you can get two allies. The more you work together, the more powerful you become. And actually bringing about positive change can come as a result of that. I've seen that in many schools through the research that we've done over the years with our master's students doing their dissertations. And then what happens is that within a school, a good idea which brings about positive change and indeed often higher attainment amongst young people will be picked up upon by others, which as a success story. And then be careful not to use best practice, because that really irritates people. If your school's one that delivers best practice, actually nobody wants to hear that. What they want to hear is your school's one that does good stuff, good practice, and then to work with others so that that good practice can spread between schools, across groups of schools, and then eventually more nationally.
Pete, does any of your work have international implications, and also what do educators and educational systems internationally might borrow from the Scottish model of learning for sustainability?
I think I'd say that, first of all, that all sustainability education is international. It has to be because of the connections that we have with the rest of the world, and that is in terms of the biophysical systems, everything that we operate within. Our food supplies are international, our travel's international, everything relates to a broader international context. But also the fundamental ideas of how people learn and how they learn to care and act are universal too. So there's nothing special about the way in which we do things here. It's perhaps that we've had the opportunity through the long-standing tradition of education in Scotland, the long-standing tradition of engaging with sustainability, to reflect on this and to try to build it into policy. Now, I suppose what I've learned through that process of the process of engaging with these sorts of issues in the Scottish context is that it takes a while, and it takes first and foremost, if you can, to find a politician, a policymaker who's willing to listen, who can then hear you out and start to understand why the issues are significant and how they might help you with that change. So I would say that's a good first step. Now, one thing that has improved in the period that I've been doing this work, which is 20 years or so, say, in depth anyway, is that the notion of sustainability is not really contested nowadays. The notion of the importance of the natural world and the relationship between the global climate and nature emergencies is pretty much out there now. So in many aspects of policy, these things are becoming more evident. So if you want the education systems to work with policy, well, it's important to argue that they need to, and showing that the work that you're doing has benefits specifically for education, for learners learning, their ability to understand these big issues, but also to help ministers, and whether it be local politicians or whether it be ministers, to fulfill the ambitions that they have, specifically with regard to a whole range of other environmental policies, transport policies, energy policies, health well-being policies, etc. Once policymakers are shown that all of this can be integrated through the concept of sustainability and the concept of education for sustainability, in our case learning for sustainability here in Scotland, then they tend to get it. So it's showing them that actually you can deliver for them as well on a whole wide range of their agendas. And one of the things that I've certainly been encouraging here Scottish policymakers to do is to always see if they can produce policy that's cross-departmental, so that the benefits will be wide-ranging, and education as a facilitator of that. And so I use this kind of spider's web as the background, but it's basically lots of lines linking up these ideas. And if you are in a position where you've ever really thought very much about how people make policy, whether it be in a national context, a school context, in my case a university context, NGO context, a local council context, you'll realise that every decision has an impact on other decisions. And trying to make a decision about one thing on its own in isolation is tough, but it's tougher if you think about all the other dimensions. And yet when you get it wrong, if you haven't done that, if you haven't thought about all these other dimensions, then you're going to be in a far worse situation than having thought about them in the first place. But the flip side to that is that there are enormous benefits of doing so if you can model the ideas appropriately in the first place. So a good example would be, how does education help the environment? How does the circular economy help the environment? How does education relate to the circular economy? Well, if you don't talk about it, people won't know about it. How does that relate to the quality of life in certain areas where people live? Well, of course, if you've got a circular economy, there's going to be less waste, there's going to be less rubbish lying around, materials will be used and reused. What impact will that have on the environment? Well, very considerable, particularly with regard to energy use. That will have a positive impact on reducing the impact of climate change. What will that do? Well, that will improve the environment, particularly because biodiversity will thrive, etc., etc. I could go on for about 10 minutes just talking about that one example. But a policymaker trying to deal with that has probably one relatively narrow frame of reference within which to operate. They can act, but if they're mindful of all these other things, they may well act in a particular way that benefits all of those, rather than a way in which they don't mean to harm them, but actually has a negative effect on all those potential changes and improvements to modern life. In a school context, that would be possible as well, particularly if you think about the way in which we don't teach subjects in an interdisciplinary fashion. And this is one of the biggest remaining problems, and there are plenty in our own Scottish education system here, is how do you engage young people in complex interdisciplinary issues, what people often refer to these days as wicked issues, where actually if you try to bring about a positive change in one area, you might well bring about a negative impact somewhere else. Well, you aren't ever going to do it unless you engage people properly with those issues within a school context, and you model that thinking. And so the spider web diagram is a means of helping teachers to show how they might link these ideas together. And I don't need to provide you with all the things that will go on the spider's web. You as a teacher, you'll just come up with all the things yourself. But the idea that you do essentially a mind map, it's a glorified mind map that helps you to say, right, what's the really key issue here? What's at the core of all this? What way can we bring about change that's positive within the school, within the community, if we work out what that core issue is and then how to work forward. And of course the way to find out what the core issue is to talk to people, to talk to the kids in the school, talk to the teachers, talk to the head teacher, talk to the parents, broadly speaking, to work out what your community is, engage them in that notion. And once you've done that, you can then start to use that collective wisdom to work out what's on the spider's web, and then how to join it up, and then how to affect change. And I think that can be applied in lots of different contexts. Certainly within the university here, we've had a lot of success in trying to show the positive benefits of changing the ways in which we do things to be much more sustainable. And that is across the estate, across the teaching elements of what we do, and that links to student well-being, staff well-being, etc. But I should just say, the great Scottish polymath, Sir Patrick Geddes, who was born in 1854 and died in 1932, is one of my great heroes. And Patrick Geddes had lots of models, and I've been asked about a couple of mine. Geddes used to say, there's nothing special about models, they're just thinking machines, and that's the purpose of them. I might, if I may, just give a little soundbite for Patrick Geddes, because he was the person who came up with the notion of heart, hand and head as a means of educating. You think first about the emotional engagement of the young people you work with, then you think about using the hands, how you can do stuff, and then you think about the head. And he said, because in that order they develop. What we do in schools, we fill the head. We don't give much opportunity for kids to use their hands, in other words, to do things, and we don't really think about the emotional engagement of young people, their affective and emotional development. But also in passing, I should say that Patrick Geddes was the originator of the idea think global, act local, in his book Cities in Evolution in 1912. And it'd probably be a fitting way for me to stop talking about spiders, webs and models with a little nod to Sir Patrick Geddes.
Pete, in contrast to sustainability, what does unsustainability look like? Something that educators and students should be aware of.
A sustainable world is one that essentially, in terms of its systems and structures, can continue indefinitely without some kind of external influence disrupting it and making it become unsustainable. And it doesn't need external influence in order for it to be sustainable. In other words, it's a self-functioning system. Now, our modern world exists in a range of different ways. It exists because of the biogeochemical systems that operate. It exists because of the social systems that operate, and very influentially the economic systems that operate, either to make our society sustainable or less sustainable. And at the moment, each of these is disrupted in favor of unsustainable practice. So we are overexploiting pretty much all of the systems that support us and support life on Earth. So that process in itself is unsustainable. It just can't carry on forever. We cannot keep having a growing population, eating more, using more of the Earth's resources, and continuing to grow and thrive, because at some point we will be limited. There will be limits to that growth. The same is true of the way in which our society functions, where currently it functions mostly in favor of those who have power and influence and wealth, and doesn't function in favor of those who are unable to have those opportunities to thrive in the ways in which they could, and I would say should. I'm not a keen user of the word should, but I think in this context it seems appropriate. But then if we think about how the economic systems of this world function, they function primarily for the benefit of a small number of elites. By elites, I don't just mean people, I mean companies that are elites. So the dominance of a relatively small number of companies, a relatively small number of individuals, skews the whole of the system that lies alongside it, the social system and the biogeochemical system, the physical systems, the earth food systems that sustain us. And it's that driving of the economy for the benefit of a few that leads us towards unsustainability. So in essence, we use the Earth's resources primarily as a means of making wealthy people and wealthy companies ever more wealthy. The term I use for this is bloated capitalism. You know, we live with capitalism. It's all around us. You know, if you sell anything, you buy anything, that's part of capitalism. I'm not arguing against that. What I do think is questionable is the way in which that system is so entirely disproportionately influential compared to the way it would have worked when the notion of capitalism first arose, and the way in which people traded goods and services. It's way out of proportion now. And that's partly because of a globalized economy that allows that to happen. I would say there's another part of the system which is really unsustainable, and that is the influence of media, and in particular social media, which peddles untruths and lies, and does so in the service of the relatively few influential people and companies that I was talking about earlier, and those include politicians and policymakers as well. So if you've got the complexity that I've described in terms of an unsustainable world, and then on top of that you have a media, be it the standard media, the conventional media, or whether it's social media, that doesn't question that, critique it and hold it to account, but actually does the opposite, as much of the media does, then that just makes the situation far worse than it would be otherwise. And then beyond that, the legislative structures within and between countries that allow that to happen, both the bloated capitalism and what one author in particular refers to as the breakdown of the information ecosystem. If there's no oversight of that by policymakers and politicians within a country, and some controls are brought to bear, then you have a recipe for continued unsustainability. If internationally we can't work together to do something to control these forces, and they exist outside of states, as many of them do, then we are in peril of having an aggravating factor which makes things worse and makes it very difficult for people to understand what reality is out there, and how they might even apprehend that kind of reality, let alone try to deal with it. So those are unsustainability factors that many people wouldn't cite alongside, say, the climate and nature emergencies, but to my mind they're absolutely interlinked. I'm not sure I've properly addressed the social element within the framework that I've just described, insofar as the integrity of and resilience of the social systems that operate within any one society and between societies is fundamental to any form of sustainable future. And so the concept of social justice essentially means that we have to give recognition of, and we have to act in order to support all of those within our societies that need support. And those who have wealth, those who have influence, should use some of their resources, some of their energy to do so. And as I said earlier, the way in which the elites operate, the companies, the individuals, the governments, they mitigate against, first of all, the recognition of the need for social justice, the opportunities for people to thrive and develop to their own maximum capacity, which is what educators try to do. And in a sense, by ignoring the fact that there's a problem, that there is a reality out there that needs to be addressed, they make the situation far worse, because they're not allowing the rest of our society to recognize that there's an issue. But of course, we have to act in order to even support human flourishing, so that we instrumentally get the best from all of those people within our societies. And for me, that idea of social justice isn't about just what happens here in my context in Scotland, or within the UK, or within Europe. It's about the whole world. And so social justice can't operate just within one country. It should exist within one country, but it must exist in terms of that country in relation to other countries. And am I talking about a redistribution of wealth? Yes, I am. Am I talking about a redistribution of opportunity. Profoundly importantly, yes, I am. And that's what educators do within the context they operate within. And the more we're able to do that, and more we're able to encourage people to think that way, that actually education is about trying to address social justice issues, then the more equitable society may well become in the long run. But we have to make sure we do so. Otherwise it will be, like I said, the politicians who don't want to talk about it, educators won't be talking about it either.
And when you talk about redistribution, I suppose you mean it's not a zero-sum game when everybody is invited to participate in policy making and have access to resources, everybody is better off?
Yes, everybody benefits, but in terms of the actual wealth of the largest companies, the most powerful companies, the most powerful and wealthy individuals, yeah, they'll have less, but that's where financial redistribution needs to take place, and that's how taxation systems work. Mm-hmm. And actually taxation systems are a product of capitalism in the first place. They're a means of redistributing wealth that arises from forms of capitalism which historically have been thought of as being over-efficient, over-effective, or indeed greedy. And so when you have states that won't tax appropriately, then the opportunity to redistribute is not there. And when individuals and companies can operate outside of state legislation and tax havens, etc., then that in turn reduces the opportunity for national redistribution, which in turn has international effects.
You've mentioned connections between societies, so I wonder what is your opinion on whether educators in developed countries are responsible in some ways to reach out to educators and societies that live under oppressive regimes and sort of, I don't know, through training, education, or whatever other tools to help them establish more democratic societies.
So I think there is a responsibility, but for context I would say if we think about the impact of colonialism in its broad sense over certainly many hundreds of years, if not millennia, we're doing this interview in the University of Edinburgh's buildings and in a city which will have profited from colonialist approaches and actually the taking of resources from other countries. And indeed that continues today through many mechanisms, not specifically Edinburgh or the UK, but through usually large multinational companies. This idea of the post-colonial landscape, it's in a way not even post-colonial. We still have that colonial approach, and the young people that we work with increasingly know that. And we're reminded of it daily. So here in my work, this is something that is a live issue. How do we work in terms of our responsibility with people in other countries where regimes are not as liberal perhaps as you're implying? Well, I think the first thing is that we have to look after our own house. We have to be trying to put that in order and to make sure that our learners understand these issues and understand that responsibility, and also that there are oppressive regimes where education is not as readily available, it isn't as liberal as it is here and in many other countries. That's what we do here. How do we help people in those countries? Well, first of all, I think it should help to know that we're concerned about this and we're trying to ensure that we educate properly. Secondly, I would say that a truth that must not speak its name is that really powerful education is subversive. It changes the ways people think, and by changing the ways people think, you start to develop the idea that change can take place, that actually you can have the power, that you can start to build different ways of working with policymakers. Now, in oppressive regimes, I have no idea how to work with that, because that's outside of my own ability. How you change the policy and politics in those countries, I'll have to leave for someone else. But what I can say is that in my experience, freeing the mind to think about what other worlds can exist, what other ways we can exist, other ways we can work with others, and the ways in which we can bring about positive change is very enlightening and very liberating. And so that idea of education being subversive is about not directly changing politics, because you'll get into trouble if you do, if you're in one of those countries, but actually changing the ways in which people think, so that your students understand that there are elements of understanding the world differently that may help them in a future way in which their country might change. Oppressive regimes generally don't last forever, but we do need to see ways in which we can work beyond those regimes to a more enlightened future.
I wonder if you have conversations like this about questioning the current policies and participating in environmental governance with your university students, those who you take up to nature, to islands, to residential programs.
Yeah, well, of course I do. And of course I spend a lot of time working with them in those ways. And we've just finished the taught part of 2 of our master's courses, and I was on a residential with those students recently, and I said to them at the end of the course, you know, the last session I had with them, what do you think this program's been about? You've spent nearly a year already studying. What do you think the taught element's been about? And on the face of it, it is an education for people who are going to become teachers, particularly using the outdoors. But the conversation went to, this is a way of thinking. This is about deeply questioning everything. It's trying to understand how the world works and being restless in the way in which you try to understand that world, and believing that you can act, and benefiting from that process of feeling empowered to be able to act. It is actually part of what I intend to do. So when I start the course, the first course that I teach, which is the first of our master's programs courses in September, what I'll have in my mind is trying to get the students to think about why the world is like it is. And the question I'll pose at the start is, what is where? Why is what where? How did what get where? What do I think and feel about what being where? So the question is, what is the what that I'm referring to? And it is everything. So for example, this building that we're in at the moment is a very old building, and it has a history, but the land beneath it has a history that predates this building. And there will be a history in the future that goes way past whether this building was ever here or not. There are people who've lived here. What about their histories? What do I think about what is where in this context? Just over here is an old volcano in the middle of Edinburgh, and I'll ask the students to think about that volcano and think of how it came to be, and how people lived in and around and with this. What about the social changes that would have taken place? And indeed, I spend quite a bit of time with the students, encouraging them to engage with these ideas aesthetically through prose and poetry. And I challenge them to think as creatively as they can about places. And I could run a whole outdoor environmental sustainability education program for a week on a piece of grass, one meter square, because I'd be getting the students to think about these ideas. You just think about, you know, grasses as a dominant species. What about the organisms in it? Why do we value organisms that we can't see in the soil less than we value organisms that we can see? Why do we find ourselves in a utilitarian sense making use of spaces and places rather than respecting those places and spaces? It goes all the way from essentially the origins of the universe right through to the prose and poetry that describes our emotional relationships with the landscape and deals with everything in between. That's what I'm trying to do with our programs. And when I get to the final course with the students, it's really challenging them to think about their interpretations of the way in which they understand and apprehend things in ways they wouldn't have done before. So if they're not challenging themselves to think differently by that point, they're going to have to do that long after they never see me again. If they're not challenging themselves, then in a way I haven't been successful. They need to be always challenging themselves to think about those questions. Why is it like this is? And then what does it mean to me and to other people that things are the way they are? And I've talked about this as if it's a thing, you know, the what is the what thing, but it's actually about concepts as well. It's the concept of democracy, of capitalism, of governance, of what social justice might mean, always questioning those ideas. So to be fair, I do work with my students in classrooms. I work with them on that piece of grass just outside that we walked round. I work with them in the local park called Holyrood Park. I work with them on the east coast of Scotland, in the Highlands, all over the place. But the last course of the year takes place on the island of Rum, spelt like the drink. And it takes place there because we can, as a group, experience a residential week where we can discuss anything. But I try to get them to start thinking about some of these ideas that started at the beginning of the academic year. And in that particular place, which is a national nature reserve, we can start to see some of these systems operating. But that's only part of it. This island used to have a community of 300 people, and they were moved off of the island in favour of sheep farming about 150 years ago. And so over on that island, you'll see deserted buildings. So I work with the students to say, well, why did that happen? What's the consequence of that happening? What changed as a result of 300 people leaving to go to Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand? Actually, it was mostly Canada they went to. But across the whole of Scotland, this process happened. It was called the clearances. So what changed in our society because of that? And so I can take them to these buildings and I can stand them in those buildings and say, imagine you lived here. What would you need? What would you need to survive here? What would you need to flourish and thrive here? What would your life be like? Did you have music? Did you have bright sunny days? How did you cope with the rain? Where did you get your food from? And so the social aspect of this is evident there, as well as, if you like, the clarity of nature's systems, and then the relationship between the island and the seas around it, and the ways in which those two interact in terms of climate, in terms of food, etc., are all there for me. But profoundly importantly, it's me and the students in a building, and outside of that building, out on the hills and across the island for 7 full days, just thinking about these sorts of issues. It's a luxury, but in terms of the university's provision for education, but at the same time, I have to say that it's, to me, not a luxury at all. It's the only way you're really going to get to some of these complex issues.
Well, these are very transformative experiences for students. I wonder what were your transformative experiences, maybe something that informed or led to what you are doing today.
Okay, so it's really funny because I have a doctoral student at the moment doing research on the very issues we're talking about, the complexity of interdisciplinary learning and how people go about teaching it in higher education, in universities at the moment. And he asked if he could come to RUM with me, with the students. And so I'm in this really strange position of having one of my doctoral students researching the impacts of my teaching with my master's students, and he'll be writing that up. And so from the point of view of the students, I wanted to start there. We'll have some information about whether it's transformative or not through his research, but I set them assignments to write, which are then assessed on the basis of them explaining to me what their learning experiences were. So I try to work with that and get them to think about their own transformative learning experiences, whether they're with the program or otherwise. For me, my transformative experiences, I suppose, started when I was at school and I had a teacher who took the trouble to take me out to do things in the outdoors. So he took me camping along with my peers at school. He took me kayaking, he took me rock climbing, he took me on trips to Norway, to Southwest Ireland, etc., to France. And as a group of students, we became very, very close. And we learnt a lot about the world and ourselves through the effort he put in. Now, not every student gets that opportunity, but that was hugely transformative for me. And I said earlier today to you today that I'm the only person in my family ever to go to university, and it was partly because of those experiences that I think I had the confidence to think I could go to a university. So in terms of my transformation into education, that would be one thing. I would say another was the opportunity to study the natural sciences, and in particular environmental sciences, and then eventually freshwater ecology, because I started to see the way in which the world was much more joined up than I ever really appreciated. So I started to get a glimpse of that complexity and interdisciplinarity through my education. And then beyond that, I would say eventually choosing to live in Scotland. I'm from the southwest of England, but I ended up living in the Central Highlands of Scotland. And I really had the most amazing opportunities to actually go out and spend time in the natural world, and to develop my skills in the outdoors so that I felt I could travel safely on land, on rock, on snow and ice, climbing, on rivers, I think I maybe said rivers, I don't know, and the sea, that I developed my skills and confidence so that I thought, I can be in this landscape, I feel comfortable in this landscape. And that was transformative, and it was about me engaging recreationally with friends. And then beyond that, having an opportunity to teach in the outdoors, and people mentoring me, people giving me the opportunity to get things wrong. So really importantly, people who would say, all right, we're going to go teach sailing today. And I'd say, well, I don't really know how to teach sailing, but, you know, and my colleague would say, give it a try, you know, what's going to go wrong? And you'd try and it would work. So I had those mentors who helped me. And then more recently, when I began my work here at the university, the person whose courses that I took over, including the ones that I've described to you, became really my mentor. Even though he'd retired, he retired soon after I arrived, he still worked with me to help me to understand the complex issues that I now work with my students, and I owe him a great debt. So it's those people who make the difference, and often for me it's been people who have seen that I was hungry for a bit of support, have given me that bit of support. I've not tried to ask too much of them, and then I've gone away and tried to do things, got things wrong, and then come back and said, that didn't work terribly well. Can you tell me how I might do it better, please? And they'd say, yes, well, it didn't work terribly well, but why don't you give it another go, and from what you've learnt. And essentially probably never told me anything very much other than supporting me in getting things wrong. And one of the things I really love about my life is that I can get things wrong and then try to get them right afterwards. It often works out in the end. So that's what I always tell my students as well.
A while ago, when I met you at an environmental education conference, you mentioned that you were preparing to talk to the Scottish Parliament about the future vision of educational system. Could you share some key points?
I'd like to say you'll have to watch the video because it's a 15-minute presentation. It took me 2 days to make 15 minutes. And it sort of boils down to the things that I've been talking about, which are around recognizing the global challenges we face and ensuring that we think about how our learners are going to face those global challenges which we're facing. And in a way it's an easy sell to politicians because they know that these challenges are out there. A lot of their daily business is around how they're going to make the economy work, how they're going to deal with social justice issues, how they're going to deal with communities, how certainly in Scotland we're going to try to address global climate change within the Scottish context. We can't solve the world's problems, so it'd be nice to try, but the notion of climate and nature being interlinked and how we try to work with that to provide solutions. So this is the day-to-day work of policymakers, and so encouraging them to think about that, but particularly in the context of curricular change. So why is it that we think that a curriculum can't change? Why do we think that the curriculum of 5 years ago is still valid now? And I give them the example of a famous book called the Saber-Tooth Curriculum by a man called Abner J. Pedawell. That wasn't his real name, but that was his pseudonym. And it's essentially saying that there's this community worried about, a long time ago, without talking thousands of years ago, worried about saber-toothed tigers attacking the people of the community. They need food, so they're worried about how they're going to catch fish. And so what they do is they train their young people to fend off the saber-toothed tigers and how to catch fish, etc. But then, of course, a glaciation comes along, and as the glaciers start to move down the valley and it gets cold, the curriculum is still teaching the children about saber-toothed tigers and how to catch fish. Well, the rivers are frozen, so what's the point of that? And there are no saber-toothed tigers, they've long gone, and the bears are coming instead. So do you carry on with the same curriculum? No, you don't. So what did I say to Scottish policymakers? I gave that as an example and say, you can't just carry on teaching the same stuff. You have to change, and you have to address the challenges of the day. And you also need to imagine what the challenges of the future are going to be and help young people to apprehend and to address those with our support. So that was the spirit of what I said to them, rather than necessarily a recipe for the future.
You just mentioned one interesting book. I wonder if you have any other book recommendations.
Okay, so yeah, I have lots. Probably as a teenager, the book that influenced me most was Silent Spring. And this book is about the impact of organochlorine pesticides. For many years we have been using these pesticides, DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, thinking they were miracle cures for pests that were damaging crops, etc. And then what Rachel Carson, who wrote the book, found in the research was the impact of those pesticides on those aquatic ecosystems, and then on the things that depended on those ecosystems, and then on the things that depended on the things that depended on those ecosystems. So, for example, birds of prey, their eggs didn't hatch because the shells were so thin, because they had had the impact of those pesticides being concentrated up through the food chain to them. So they were eating the things that were eating the things that were in the rivers in the first place. And it's that concentration of pesticides that made me think about how interconnected the world was. So that was number one, I suppose. A novel that really impacted me was To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee. And it, in particular, one quote in that book, the whole book is worth reading for one quote. And it's when one of the heroes in the book talks to his daughter and says, "You'll never understand another person's point of view until you climb inside his skin and walk around in it for a while." And for me, that's been really an important aspect of the way in which I try to think about the world. You know, what if I'm advocating something, if I'm trying to get learners to learn something, what is it like to be inside their skin and inside their head? How can I know? Well, I can't know, but I try to understand. So that's another thing that's been influential. There are many since then, but a couple of ones I've read recently. One of them is by Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote a book called Sapiens, then another one called Homo Deus, and another one called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And Harari is a historical philosopher, really. He is a historian by training, but his writing is really provocative, and he tries to sort of apprehend why the world is like it is and how we interface with that world. And it's relatively easy reading, but very challenging insofar as he'll say something in one sentence that you think, if I tried to write that down, it would take me 3 pages and then I wouldn't say it right. And so it's beautiful, powerful, and really provocative. Most recently, and this is just in the last couple of weeks, and that's probably why it's most in my mind, but I've talked to you earlier about diet and the way in which that might be a way into thinking about sustainability. I listened to a book which is called Highly Processed People by a British doctor and television presenter and researcher by the name of Chris Van Tulleken. And it's all about the global food industry, and in particular the ways in which some global companies have dominated the way in which we understand food, the ways in which we eat food, the ways in which what kinds of food we want, and in so doing have changed the face of the planet by, in particular, driving soya and palm oil production in various parts of the world. And that's having a global climate impact. And part of my own work and previous research with doctoral students is on things like global food related issues. So this book actually I found to be extremely powerful in actually naming names and saying Nestle did this, Coke did this, etc. And saying this is why these communities have been impacted. This is why people have problems with obesity. It's not their fault that they're overweight. They're overweight because they're being pushed rubbish food by these companies. And we don't know any different anymore because we're so used to highly processed food. What do I mean by highly processed food? Anything that comes wrapped in plastic primarily, and anything that you don't have the ingredients for in your kitchen would be a good starting point, which is what the author suggests as a good basis. So that's one of the more influential books I've read recently, and it's partly because he draws together social justice issues with environmental issues, with global capitalism, with the lack of legislative power, the lack of control over the substances that are in foods in ways in which if they were medical products, they would be controlled. But because they're deemed to be food products, we don't control them. That draws in the influence of the food lobby on governments, etc. A lot of the stuff that I've been talking about. Given that I now live in Scotland and I'm attached to this place, there's a great Scottish novelist who died recently. His name's Ian Banks. Ian was a great novelist, but he was also a great science fiction writer. And when he died, someone in the press said, when Ian Banks died, we lost two of our greatest authors because he wrote novels and science fiction. And he wrote a novel called The Crow Road, which is a wonderful novel about the west coast of Scotland, and in particular there are elements of it that relate to relationship with landscape, and that's been quite important to me. Another book I read a long while back that really moved me was The Silver Darlings, which is about the way in which people were cleared off the land. I told you about that, and they weren't all sent to the New World, but they were forced to go out to the coasts and become fishermen. And as a consequence of that, whole communities were disrupted. These aren't books, but I would say anything that David Attenborough has ever done that's film, watch it. Certainly all of his earlier stuff, and then all of the stuff on, The Blue Planet, etc. Very famous television programs produced by the BBC, and all the books that go with those. They've been very, very influential in my life, really, and continue to be so. I have read quite a lot of poetry over the years, and here's one of my favourite poems. It's called A Man in Assynt, and that poem speaks of relationship to the landscape. I suppose quite a bit of the reading that I have done over the years is, I suppose, technical and relates to the landscape of Scotland. And another book that really opened my mind was James Hunter's book called On the Other Side of Sorrow, and it's about the relationship of people with the landscape of Scotland. So I'd recommend it too.
What contribution do you hope to make through your work?
So in terms of my teaching, I think it's to encourage students to be thoughtful, caring, and questioning, and to always be restless in terms of trying to understand and trying to do the right things as far as they think those things are right by their standards, having examined all the evidence that they can get their hands on. And it's a challenge, but actually on a daily basis, I find that I can often do so personally by trying to just focus on small decisions, each decision, And then when I'm teaching, in particular, it's about why am I trying to teach this to these people now? What am I trying to get from this? And I hope that that each of the students that I work with, you know, eventually when they come to the end of their career, or indeed the end of their life, they're thinking, I've tried to do the best I can in the circumstances that were presented to me, and I've tried to do the best I can for people, planet and place, and what more could you ask for if that's what they do? And I have to say one more thing. I work with educators a lot, and I nearly always remind them that they are the most important people on the planet. Teachers are the most important people on the planet, and don't ever forget it.